Hey, welcome to the final video in the Combat Curve series where we're going to show you how to make your own curves. Because really, you can use any curve you like. The curves don't have to conform to any special pattern or anything like that. Just remember that there are 3 pillars that you have to follow. You need to make sure you have clear definition for the player experience. You need to make sure you have a curve that maps onto that. And you need to make sure that you have mechanics that then make up the curve. Now you can start anywhere. If you start with the curve, you can totally do that. Just start arbitrarily making a curve and asking yourself, well, if it starts high, what does that imply? If it starts low, what does that imply? If it starts high and then dips immediately, what does that imply? If it starts high and then doesn't dip at all, what does that imply? Any combination of peaks and valleys, you can figure out a way to make that work. You can find a justification. And the thing about this justification is there's no absolutely correct answer to the justification, but it's all about creating a really cohesive and internally consistent design. So if you do come up with an explanation for what that curve might mean, make sure that your player experience and your game mechanics support it. You can also start with mechanics. And one of the examples of starting with mechanics would be something like, well, the players are in this space and only this kind of creature would be in this space, or you've set up a particular boss already and you've already told them what kind of creature that is, so you know the mechanics first. Totally fine. Figure out what the player experience might be, or figure out what the curve might be, and then go back and do the rest and keep iterating on all 3 until they all make sense together. Just like we went over in the introduction, it's important to remember that player experience needs to be defined clearly, concretely, and precisely. And that's really important. And here's an example from the mini-boss curve. Players have to approach the fight with confidence. Then, they realize that the fight is harder than they thought it would be. But then, over the course of a couple of rounds, they start to get a handle on the fight and feel like this is pretty doable, until they finally succeed. That is a pretty clear set of player emotions that create the player experience, and you can see how that can be applied to narrative. Easily, very easily applied to narrative. So here's a bad example. The combat should be fun, and the boss should be quite hard to kill because the players should have to deal with a big challenge. So that's bad for a couple reasons. One, obviously, it's very broad, it's completely vague, and it's really hard to figure out what you would actually do with that information. But also, whether the creature is supposed to be hard to kill is completely up to you as the DM. You have the power to change that, and every other element of the creature. So it is a little arbitrary, and then the extent to which it's not arbitrary, it's just not very useful. And you should be aiming to define player experiences in a way that is most valuable to you as a designer. So combat curve, the curve itself, you should be iterating a lot here. So first you want to know, well, does the curve actually map onto the player experience I'm looking for? And is the player experience concrete enough? Because as you start figuring out the curve, the player experience is going to be easier to define. Just like with how I define the player experience of the mini boss, you can see how the curve itself and the player experience are very closely linked. They're very much intrinsically connected. So you're going to want to iterate on both of those things a lot to make sure that yours are also really connected, because if they're not, then you're probably not creating an internally cohesive design. Finally, we have mechanics. Now, these are tricky. It requires a lot of testing, which is unfortunate because it's something that's hard to do as a DM, because you can only give your players the encounter once. But that's okay, because if you go through this really concerted, really concrete process of developing the combat curve, you're gonna find that if you're thinking about what you could have done differently, there's a lot more to go back and think about, and you have a lot more room for improvement, and you're definitely going to get a lot better a lot faster because you know exactly what you're trying to do at every stage. So having that kind of really concrete, really clear process helps you improve a lot faster. So I just drew an arbitrary curve here, and we're just going to see if we can justify it. Now it starts low. That suggests to me that the players are probably pretty confident. If it started higher, they would either be aware of the fight but not confident, or unaware of the fight, and then when the fight broke out, their surprise would spike their intensity so that the battle starts at high intensity, like with the surprise. Then it ramps up slowly, a little bit, and then there's a little spike, and then it dips again, and then it ramps up again into its highest point of intensity, but it never goes that high. And then it dips again, and then there's a second spike, a third spike really, that is a little bit lower than the second one, but higher than the first one before it peters out into, well, a rather relatively standard resolution. So this second spike could be a lot of things. The rise means that there has to be some kind of danger. If it is just one skeleton, then it has to call a few of its friends, or maybe multiple skeletons pop up out of the ground, or some zombies show up, or it turns out it's a much more powerful skeleton than they thought, but not that much more powerful, because if it was really powerful, this would have spiked a lot. So instead, it's probably just like, it's a little more powerful than they thought, and then maybe it throws off one ability at one point during the first round that catches the players rather off guard. But because it dips so fast, it's probably nothing major. It's probably nothing that recontextualizes the fight for them. It's probably just, oh, I didn't expect the skeleton to do that much. Now, again, this could be anything. This is just what I'm making up as I go. Then it dips a little bit, and I'm going to say that that's because they're aware of the skeleton's abilities, but it's not that scary because it hit them already and it's not that big of a deal. Then it starts to rise again. So this is when I say either a bunch of enemies come in, maybe they fled the room, maybe the skeleton has some ability that makes him big and scary, maybe the skeleton gets consumed by something else, and that something else is now the encounter and it's not the skeleton anymore, or whatever. Really, there just has to be a huge ramp up in difficulty / intensity. Well, in intensity, it doesn't necessarily have to be difficulty. So let's say something consumes the skeleton. Some other thing that's also not that scary comes in and then consumes the skeleton. And it coming in, being not very scary, is part of the gradual ramping up process. But then on its turn, it consumes the skeleton, becomes much more powerful, and that accounts for the big middle spike. But it's not that powerful compared to the players in the sense that it doesn't have a ton of crazy abilities, and it more or less does what the players expected, but it is fairly dangerous still. So then they kind of get a handle on it and things are going okay. But when it dies, it explodes into more skeletons. I don't even know. I'm just making it up. It explodes into a whole bunch of skeletons, and now there's a huge pile of skeletons that the players have to deal with, and that's the second big spike, the third overall spike. And now the players have to deal with all these skeletons, and oh my god, that's so crazy. But then they start slowly getting rid of the skeletons, and the combat curve ramps down. Now, I came up with mechanics based on the graph. The player experience is probably something like not very much fear at first. They're pretty confident going to fight with the skeleton. They're surprised when the skeleton is a little bit stronger than they expected, but not that surprised. But then there's sort of a reveal when the other creature eats the skeleton or consumes it, and the players are definitely very surprised. Then they fight it, get a handle on it, but then there's a second surprise when it bursts into tiny skeletons, and then as they slowly clear out the skeletons, of course, they start to feel a little bit more comfortable. So that's roughly a decent player experience, roughly an okay curve, and roughly an okay set of game mechanics. Now, there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done there, but hopefully it's clear what the work would be. That's the main point, is that as you move forward, what that work is should be clear, just like with our player experience examples where it's all about implying your next step as a designer. Every step should imply the next one, and that goes for all of these steps as well. So I didn't want to go crazy on this example. It's just a little thing. I just wanted to show off a little bit how it worked so that you would have a decent example to work from. But really, go nuts. I don't have any of my main examples. None of those have 3 spikes. I mean, there's one in the big boss where there's like a variant that has a couple little ones in it. But you could even add more to this. You could just add spikes all over the place. In fact, if you zoomed in really close and got really granular, you could even maybe account for like all the different things that the enemies are doing on all of their turns. But I wouldn't recommend that because, of course, there's a lot of variance in the way that a fight plays out thanks to rolls, thanks to player decisions, and things like that. So you generally want to keep it somewhat high level, but that's really how combat curves work. I hope these combat curves have been helpful. They really are there to help you do what you are trying to accomplish and not to tell you this is how I DM my games, do it like me, just to give you a process that I found works really well for me from a game designer's perspective. Again, I hope it works out for you, and please let me know how it goes. I'm always really curious to see if you can either employ my own curves or if you've come up with crazy curves that I've never thought of. It's always interesting to see some new curves, but that's really it for the Combat Curve series. So if it's been helpful, then awesome. I'm really glad. And, you know, check out some of my other videos. They're good too, maybe. All right, bye.